A millionaire wakes up to find his house submerged in an inexplicable silence. When he realizes that his twin daughters have disappeared, despair consumes him, and his partner pretends to be surprised in the middle of the chaos. What he doesn't imagine is that the only one willing to search for the truth is the most underestimated woman in the house, the maid. Watch until the end to see how everything unfolds. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us from which city you're watching us. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll hear in your life. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of the Hampton estate, casting golden patterns across the marble floors. Robert Whitmore had built his fortune from nothing, turning a small tech startup into a billion-dollar empire, but none of that mattered anymore. The only wealth that truly counted were the two precious girls sleeping in the nursery down the hall. His twin daughters, Emily and Grace, born just 3 months ago, had become his entire world after his beloved wife Catherine passed during childbirth. Every gurgling laugh, every tiny yawn, every moment with them felt like a gift he didn't deserve but treasured beyond measure. He stretched in bed, noting the unusual silence that filled the house. Usually by this hour he could hear the soft sounds of feeding time, the gentle cooing of his daughters, the padding of feet in the hallway. But today, nothing. A strange unease crept into his chest as he pulled on his robe and walked toward the nursery. The door stood slightly ajar, which wasn't unusual, but something about the quality of the silence made his heart begin to race. When he pushed the door open, his world shattered. The cribs were immaculate, perfectly made with fresh linens but completely empty. The stuffed animals sat in neat rows, undisturbed. The baby monitor lay silent on the dresser. For a moment Robert couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at those empty cribs, as if willing his daughters to materialize from thin air. He screamed for Victoria, his companion of the past year, the woman who had helped him through the darkest period of his grief. She appeared moments later from her bedroom, her blonde hair disheveled, her face a portrait of confusion and horror that matched his own. What neither of them knew in that moment was that Victoria's performance was exactly that, a carefully rehearsed act. While Robert had slept the night before, trusting and vulnerable in his grief, Victoria had wrapped Emily and Grace in pink blankets and carried them to a deserted parking garage 3 miles away. There, she had handed them over to a man who specialized in making problems disappear, accepting $100,000 in cash for her own flesh and blood. Well, not her flesh and blood, she reminded herself. These were Catherine's children, constant reminders of a woman Robert had loved more than he could ever love. Her, they were obstacles, nothing more. Victoria had calculated everything perfectly. Robert, emotionally fragile and desperate for companionship after Catherine's passing, would believe her story of a break-in. The authorities would investigate, find nothing, and eventually the case would go cold. Robert would grieve, but she would be there to comfort him, to fill the void, to finally have him all to herself, without those crying reminders of his dead wife demanding his attention every hour of every day. But Victoria had made one critical mistake in her planning. She had underestimated Maria Santos. Maria had worked for the Whitmore family for 12 years, long before Robert had accumulated his wealth, back when he was just a struggling entrepreneur working out of a garage. She had been there when Catherine was alive, had helped prepare the nursery for the twins, had stayed up countless nights after Catherine passed, caring for Emily and Grace as if they were her own. She had embroidered their initials onto special blankets, sung them Spanish lullabies her own mother had taught her, and loved them with a fierce protectiveness that went beyond employment. When Maria arrived for work that morning and heard the commotion, her heart dropped. She rushed to the nursery and immediately knew something was profoundly wrong. The blankets in the cribs weren't the ones she had made. These were store-bought, generic, nothing like the hand-stitched ones with the delicate pink roses and the carefully embroidered initials. The room was too perfect, too staged. In her years of caring for children, Maria had never seen a scene of distress that looked this orderly. The police arrived within 20 minutes, led by Detective James Morrison, a veteran investigator with 30 years on the force. Victoria played her part beautifully, weeping into tissues, clutching Robert's arm, her voice breaking as she recounted her version of events. She claimed she had heard noises around 3 in the morning, but assumed it was just the house settling. When she checked on the babies at 6, they were gone. Then Victoria did something that made Maria's blood run cold. With tears streaming down her face, Victoria suggested that perhaps Maria knew more than she was saying. After all, Victoria pointed out, Maria had been acting strangely lately, seemed overly attached to the girls. And hadn't she lost a child of her own years ago? Perhaps the trauma had resurfaced. Perhaps she wasn't mentally stable enough to be around children anymore. Detective Morrison's eyes shifted to Maria, and she felt the weight of suspicion settle on her shoulders. Robert, desperate and destroyed, began to look at her differently. The man she had served faithfully for over a decade was now viewing her as a potential threat to his children. Maria's hands trembled as she tried to explain about the blankets, about how wrong the room looked, but her English failed her in her distress, words tumbling out in a mix of Spanish and broken sentences that only made her seem more unstable. Victoria watched with barely concealed satisfaction as doubt spread through the room like poison. That evening, after hours of questioning, Robert called Maria into his study. His face was haggard, aged 10 years in a single day. He asked her directly if she had taken his daughters, if her grief over her own loss had driven her to do something desperate. The accusation hit Maria like a physical blow. She had given this family everything, had loved these children as her own, and now she was being accused of harming them. Maria could have collapsed. She could have accepted the injustice, gone home and let the investigation take its course. But something Catherine had once told her echoed in her mind. It was during Catherine's pregnancy, on a quiet afternoon when they were folding baby clothes together. Catherine had said that Maria had a gift, an instinct for truth, and that she should always trust it, even when everyone else doubted her. That night, Maria made a decision. If no one else would search for Emily and Grace, she would do it herself. She started with the blankets. The ones in the cribs were expensive, purchased from an upscale baby boutique in Manhattan. Maria visited the store the next day, showing the staff photos of the blankets on her phone. A young saleswoman remembered selling several identical sets about 2 weeks ago to a blonde woman who paid in cash. The description matched Victoria perfectly, but that wasn't enough. Maria needed more. For 3 days, Maria barely slept. She visited neighborhoods she had never been to before, showing pictures of the twins to anyone who would listen. Most people ignored her, but a few remembered seeing a well-dressed blonde woman in unusual places wealthy women typically didn't go. A laundromat in Queens, a cash-only diner in the Bronx, a shabby apartment building in a rundown section of Brooklyn. At the laundromat, Maria met an attendant named Rosa who recognized the description of the embroidered blankets. Rosa explained that about 3 weeks ago, a woman matching Victoria's description had brought in one of Maria's handmade blankets and asked if Rosa could copy the design onto 2 new blankets. The woman had paid triple the normal rate and insisted on complete discretion. Rosa still had the pattern she had drawn to replicate the embroidery. When Maria saw it, tears filled her eyes. This was proof that someone had planned to replace the real blankets with fakes. But who was the woman? Rosa remembered one crucial detail. The blonde woman had been with someone else, a dark-haired woman who called her by a nickname. Rosa couldn't remember the exact name, but she recalled it started with a V. Maria's investigation led her deeper into a world she had only heard about in whispered conversations. She learned about houses where children were kept temporarily, off the books, while arrangements were made for illegal placements. One name kept appearing in her inquiries, a woman named Linda Chen who ran what was euphemistically called a transitional care facility in a converted brownstone in a forgotten corner of Brooklyn. It took Maria 2 more days to find the address. When she arrived, the building looked abandoned from the outside, windows covered with faded curtains, paint peeling from the facade. But Maria could hear something that made her heart stop. Crying, the unmistakable sound of babies crying. She didn't hesitate. Maria pushed through the front door, which wasn't locked, and followed the sound up a narrow staircase. On the 2nd floor, she found a room with 4 cribs. 3 were occupied. In the far corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a baby girl with a distinctive birthmark on her left shoulder, just like Emily. Maria rushed forward and scooped the child into her arms. Emily was thinner than she should be, her cheeks hollow, but she was alive. When Emily saw Maria's face, something miraculous happened. The baby, who at 3 months old shouldn't have been able to form words, made a sound that sent chills down Maria's spine. It wasn't quite a word, but it sounded unmistakably like soul, the Spanish word for son, the nickname Maria had given her because of her bright disposition. Maria held Emily close, tears streaming down her face, and made a promise. She would bring her home, and she would find Grace. But Maria wasn't alone in that room. Linda Chen emerged from a back bedroom, her face registering shock at the intrusion. Before she could call for help, Maria did something she had never done in her life. She pulled out her phone, hit record, and confronted the woman with everything she knew. Linda, caught off guard and clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, began to defend herself, and in doing so revealed far more than she intended. Yes, she had been paid to keep the baby. Yes, it was by a woman named Victoria, someone she had worked with before on similar arrangements. Yes, there was another baby, but she wasn't here. The other one had been taken to a different location, somewhere in New Jersey, to reduce the risk of both children being found together. Maria had her confession, recorded clearly on her phone. She also had Emily, and she wasn't letting her go. The confrontation that followed was brief but intense. Linda tried to grab the phone, but Maria was stronger than she looked, strengthened by desperation and love. She managed to get out of the building with Emily and immediately called Detective Morrison. What Maria didn't know was that while she was rescuing Emily, Robert was making discoveries of his own. Unable to sleep, tormented by doubt about Maria, but also increasingly suspicious of Victoria's behavior, Robert had begun looking through financial records. Victoria's spending had increased dramatically in the past month, with large cash withdrawals that she couldn't or wouldn't explain. Then, while searching through a closet for something completely unrelated, Robert found one of the twins' favorite toys, a small elephant that played a lullaby when squeezed. This toy was supposed to have been in Emily's crib the night of the disappearance. Robert picked up the elephant, squeezing it absent-mindedly, and heard the familiar tune. But then something else happened. A small compartment in the toy's base popped open, revealing a tiny recording device, something Catherine had installed months ago as a makeshift baby monitor backup. Robert pressed play, not expecting to hear anything but static. Instead, he heard Victoria's voice, crystal clear, recorded by pure chance just days before the twins vanished. She was on the phone with someone, discussing payment arrangements, timing, and explicitly mentioning the twins by name. The recording was brief, cut off mid-sentence, but it was enough. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had brought into his home and his life, had been planning this all along. Robert's hands shook as he listened to the recording 3 times, then 4, unable to process what it meant. The grief that had been consuming him transformed instantly into rage, then into a cold, calculated determination. He needed to find his daughters, and he needed to expose Victoria for what she truly was. But before Robert could act on his discovery, Maria's situation took a dangerous turn. An anonymous call to a psychiatric services line reported that a woman named Maria Santos was experiencing a mental health crisis, exhibiting paranoid delusions and potentially dangerous behavior toward children. The caller, whose voice was distorted, but whose description perfectly matched Victoria, claimed that Maria had a history of psychological instability and needed immediate evaluation. 2 days after Maria rescued Emily, a court-appointed psychiatrist arrived at her small apartment with a police escort, carrying papers for an involuntary psychiatric evaluation. Maria, exhausted from her investigation and caring for Emily while hiding her from Victoria, didn't understand what was happening at first. When she realized they intended to take her away and potentially separate her from Emily, she panicked. It was only the intervention of Rosa, the laundromat attendant who had become an unlikely ally, that prevented disaster. Rosa arrived at Maria's apartment with her own recording, a copy she had made of Maria's conversation with Linda Chen. She played it for the psychiatrist and the police, providing evidence that Maria wasn't delusional at all, but had been telling the truth about Victoria's involvement. The psychiatrist, a compassionate woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, listened to the recording and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of taking Maria in for evaluation, she contacted Detective Morrison directly and insisted he listen to the evidence. Within hours, the investigation shifted entirely. Detective Morrison, accompanied by Robert, who was now carrying his own evidence from the toy's recorder, arrived at the Hampton estate with a warrant. Victoria, sensing that her carefully constructed world was collapsing, maintained her composure initially. She sat in the living room, perfectly groomed, her expression one of concerned confusion as the detective explained they had new evidence. Robert stood in the doorway, the elephant toy in his hand, and pressed play. As Victoria's recorded voice filled the room, her face finally showed a crack in the facade. The mask of the grieving stepmother slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. Detective Morrison revealed that they had found Emily and had leads on Grace's location. He showed Victoria the recording Maria had made with Linda Chen. He presented financial records that tracked her cash withdrawals and payments, and then Robert pulled out one final piece of evidence that neither the detective nor Maria knew existed. While cleaning out Catherine's old desk, something he had been unable to do until now, Robert had found his late wife's journal. In it, Catherine had written extensively about her concerns regarding Victoria, about how something felt wrong about the way Victoria looked at the twins, about a conversation she had overheard where Victoria was discussing her frustrations about Catherine's pregnancy. The entries were dated just weeks before Catherine passed, and they read like warnings from beyond the grave. Confronted with overwhelming evidence, Victoria still tried to maintain her innocence, but Detective Morrison had one more card to play. They had located Grace. Acting on information from Linda Chen, who had cooperated in exchange for reduced charges, they had found the second twin at a house in Newark, being cared for by another woman who had been paid by Victoria. Grace was malnourished and frightened but alive. Robert's relief at hearing his daughter was safe was so profound that he collapsed into a chair, his entire body shaking. Detective Morrison made the call, and within 2 hours, Grace was on her way back to Hampton, escorted by Child Protective Services. During those 2 hours, Victoria finally broke. She didn't confess out of remorse or guilt. She confessed out of anger, out of frustration that her perfect plan had been destroyed by a housekeeper and a handful of coincidences. She explained with chilling casualness that the twins were obstacles to her relationship with Robert, that he was obsessed with them, that they represented Catherine's ghost haunting the house and preventing Victoria from truly becoming the lady of the estate. She had planned everything meticulously, or so she thought, paying people she believed could be trusted, creating the perfect scenario of a random abduction. Her only miscalculation, she admitted with bitter irony, was underestimating the love of a woman she had considered beneath her notice. When Grace arrived at the estate, carried by a social worker, Robert took his daughter in his arms and wept. Maria, who had been waiting in the kitchen with Emily, brought the other twin out, and for the first time in days, the sisters were reunited. They reached for each other with tiny hands, making soft sounds of recognition that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Robert turned to Maria, and the words he wanted to say stuck in his throat. How do you apologize for doubting someone who risked everything to save your children? How do you express gratitude that goes beyond language, beyond compensation, beyond anything money could buy? Maria, holding Emily, simply looked at him with understanding in her eyes. She knew the pain he had been through, the manipulation he had endured, but she also needed him to know something crucial. In careful English, she told him that she would stay and help him care for the twins, but only if things changed. She could not be just an employee anymore, not after what they had been through. She needed to be treated with respect, as a member of the family, as someone whose opinions and instincts mattered. She needed him to trust her, truly trust her, the way Catherine had. Robert agreed without hesitation. More than that, he promised that Maria would have legal guardianship rights, that she would be named in his will as the girl's guardian if anything ever happened to him, and that she would have a say in every major decision affecting Emily and Grace's upbringing. Victoria was arrested that evening, led out of the estate in handcuffs while news crews captured every moment. The case became a sensation, another cautionary tale of wealth and betrayal that the media devoured hungrily. But inside the Hampton estate, something quieter and more profound was happening. The days following Victoria's removal from the house passed in a blur of doctor's appointments, police statements, and the gradual return to something resembling normalcy. Emily and Grace were examined thoroughly by pediatricians who confirmed they were underweight and slightly developmentally delayed, but would recover fully with proper care and nutrition. The physical recovery would be the easy part. The emotional healing would take much longer. Robert threw himself into fatherhood with an intensity that surprised everyone, including himself. For months after Catherine passed, he had been present in body, but absent in spirit, relying on Maria and Victoria to handle the actual work of raising the twins while he buried himself in business and grief. Now everything was different. He learned to change diapers, though his first attempts were disasters that had Maria hiding her smiles. He figured out how to warm bottles to the perfect temperature, how to burp the girls without getting spit up on his expensive suits, how to rock them to sleep at 3 in the morning when they woke crying. The first night he successfully got both girls to sleep without Maria's help. He felt a sense of accomplishment that surpassed any business deal he had ever closed. He stood in the nursery doorway, watching their tiny chests rise and fall in peaceful rhythm, and felt something unlock in his heart that had been frozen since Catherine's passing. Maria watched this transformation with a mixture of relief and something else she couldn't quite name. She had known Robert for 12 years, had seen him build his empire from nothing, had witnessed his love story with Catherine unfold like something from a movie. But this version of Robert, the one who sat on the nursery floor at midnight singing off-key lullabies, was someone new, someone she found herself caring about in ways that went beyond employer and employee, beyond gratitude for believing her in the end. The house settled into new rhythms. Robert worked from home most days, conducting meetings from his study while keeping the baby monitor nearby. Maria established herself in the room next to the nursery, always within earshot of the girls. They moved around each other carefully at first, both hyper-aware of the shift in their relationship, but uncertain how to navigate it. 3 weeks after Victoria's apprehension, Detective Morrison came to the estate for a final interview. He needed to gather some remaining details for the prosecution's case. As he sat in the living room, he observed Robert and Maria working together to feed the twins, passing bottles and burp cloths with the practiced efficiency of a team that had been doing this together for years. Before he left, Morrison pulled Robert aside and said something that would echo in Robert's mind for weeks to come. He told him that in 30 years of investigating cases, he had rarely seen the kind of devotion Maria had shown. She had risked her reputation, her mental health evaluation, even potential charges if things had gone wrong, all because she loved those children. Morrison said that kind of love was rare and should be cherished, that Robert was a fortunate man to have someone like that in his life. Robert knew the detective was right. He had been fortunate in love once with Catherine, and he had thought that was his only chance at that kind of connection. But watching Maria with Emily and Grace, seeing the fierce protectiveness and tender care she gave them every single day, he realized that love came in many forms and that fortune sometimes offered second chances when you least expected them. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday evening in late September. The twins had been particularly fussy all day, both teething and miserable. Maria and Robert had tag-teamed the difficult day, trading off who handled which crying baby, supporting each other through the exhaustion. By evening, both girls finally fell asleep, and Robert and Maria found themselves collapsed on the living room couch, too tired to move. Maria had gotten up to make tea, something she did every evening, a small ritual of comfort from her childhood in Mexico. She brought 2 cups into the living room, handing one to Robert without thinking, and settled back onto the opposite end of the couch. They sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the rain against the windows and the soft static of the baby monitor. Robert looked at Maria in the soft lamplight, really looked at her for perhaps the first time, Her hair was escaping from its usual bun. There were dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights, and she wore one of her practical cotton dresses that had seen better days. She was beautiful in a way he had never allowed himself to notice before, beautiful in her exhaustion and dedication and strength. Maria felt his gaze and turned to meet it. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of all they had been through together, all they had survived, all they had built in the aftermath of tragedy. Neither of them spoke. The moment was too fragile for words. Over the following weeks, small changes accumulated like drops of water filling a vessel. Robert began leaving Maria's tea on her nightstand when she fell asleep on the nursery floor. Maria started preparing Robert's favorite meals from his childhood, dishes his mother used to make, recipes she extracted from him through careful conversation. Their hands would brush when passing the babies back and forth, and the contact would linger just a moment too long to be accidental. They began having dinner together after the girls went to sleep, at first discussing practical matters about schedules and pediatrician appointments, but gradually expanding into real conversations about their lives, their dreams, their fears. Robert learned about Maria's family in Oaxaca, about the daughter she had lost to illness 15 years ago when medical care came too late, about her journey to America in search of a better life. Maria learned about Robert's childhood in poverty, about the guilt he felt over Catherine's passing during childbirth, about his fear that he wasn't capable of being the father his daughters needed. One evening in late October, Robert found Maria in Catherine's old study, a room that had remained largely untouched since her passing. Maria was looking at a photo on the desk, a picture of Catherine pregnant with the twins, glowing with happiness and anticipation. When Robert entered, Maria moved to leave, but he asked her to stay. He picked up the photo and looked at it for a long moment, then told Maria something he had never shared with anyone. He said that Catherine had spoken about Maria frequently during her pregnancy, that she had told him if anything ever happened to her, Maria should help raise the girls. Catherine had trusted Maria in ways she had trusted few other people, and Robert admitted he should have remembered that trust when Victoria first cast doubt on Maria's character. Maria listened with tears in her eyes, and when Robert finished speaking, she told him something equally important. She said that Catherine had spoken to her, too, toward the end of the pregnancy, when she sensed something was wrong with Victoria. Catherine had asked Maria to watch over the girls and over Robert if anything happened to her. She had made Maria promise to always tell Robert the truth, even when it was difficult, even when he didn't want to hear it. In that moment, both of them realized they were honoring Catherine's memory, not by living in the past, but by building something new, something she would have wanted for her daughters and for the two people she had loved most. The guilt they had both been carrying about their growing feelings began to ease, replaced by a sense that perhaps this was meant to be, that Catherine's final gift was bringing them together. The first time Robert kissed Maria, it was spontaneous and unexpected. They were in the kitchen late at night. Emily had just gone back to sleep after a difficult hour of crying, and they were both exhausted and relieved. Maria had made a joke about Robert's disheveled appearance, and he had laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. The laughter brought them close together, and suddenly the distance between them disappeared entirely. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question more than a statement. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard, uncertain what to say. Robert started to apologize, worried he had overstepped, but Maria stopped him with a finger on his lips. She told him in her careful English that she had been feeling the same way but hadn't known if it was appropriate, if it was too soon, if it was what he truly wanted or just gratitude for saving his daughters. Robert took her hands and told her that what he felt had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with who she was, the woman who fought for his children when everyone else doubted her, the woman who brought light back into a house that had been drowning in darkness, the woman he wanted to build a life with, if she would have him. Maria's answer was to kiss him again, and this time there was no hesitation, no doubt, only the certainty of two people who had found each other through the worst circumstances imaginable and emerged stronger together. Their relationship deepened naturally from there, though they kept it private at first, wanting to be certain before they made any announcements. They continued to live in the same house, Robert in his master suite and Maria in her room near the nursery. But the emotional distance had disappeared entirely. They were partners in every sense, raising the twins together, making decisions together, building a family that looked nothing like what either of them had planned, but felt absolutely right. The twins responded to the change with the intuitive wisdom of children. Emily and Grace, now 6 months old, began treating both Robert and Maria as equal sources of comfort and care. They would reach for either adult when upset, smile at both with equal joy, and had begun making sounds that resembled both Dada and Sole, their names for the two people who formed the center of their universe. In December, 3 months after Victoria's case went to trial, Robert made a decision. He called Maria into the living room one evening after the girls were asleep and asked her to sit down. From his pocket he pulled a small box and Maria's heart began to race. Robert opened the box to reveal a simple but beautiful ring, a square-cut diamond on a platinum band. He told Maria that he wasn't asking her to replace Catherine, that what they had was different but equally real, and that he wanted to make their family official if she was willing. He wanted to marry her, to give the twins a mother who loved them unconditionally, to build a life together based on respect, trust and love. Maria looked at the ring, then at Robert, and felt a surge of emotion so powerful she could barely speak. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the tiny babies sleeping upstairs who had become her whole world, about the man sitting before her who had learned to trust again despite betrayal. She thought about Catherine too, about the promise she had made, and somehow knew in her heart that Catherine would approve. She said yes. They married quietly in a small ceremony at the estate in January, with just a handful of close friends and Detective Morrison as a witness. Emily and Grace, now 7 months old and chubby with health, were dressed in matching white dresses that Maria had embroidered herself, continuing the tradition she had started before their birth. The girls babbled happily throughout the ceremony, providing an unconventional but perfect soundtrack to their parents' vows. Victoria's trial concluded in February. She was convicted on multiple charges related to the arrangement involving the twins and received a substantial sentence. The media circus that had surrounded the case gradually died down, allowing the newly formed Whitmore Santos family to fade from public attention and focus on their private life. By spring, the house in the Hamptons had transformed completely. The sterile, perfect showcase that Victoria had maintained became warm and lived in, filled with children's toys and laughter and the comfortable mess of family life. Robert cut back his work hours dramatically, delegating more responsibilities to trusted colleagues so he could be present for his daughters. Maria continued to care for the girls, but now as their mother in every sense that mattered, not as an employee, but as an equal partner in their upbringing. The girls thrived. By their first birthday, Emily and Grace were walking, chattering in a mixture of English and Spanish, and showing distinct personalities. Emily was bold and adventurous, always trying to climb on furniture and explore new spaces. Grace was more contemplative, content to sit with books and study pictures for long periods. Both showed the resilience of children who were loved beyond measure, with no memory of the trauma they had survived as infants. On a warm afternoon in June, Robert and Maria sat on the back patio watching the twins play in a sandbox Robert had built. Grace was carefully organizing toys, while Emily enthusiastically threw sand in every direction. Maria leaned against Robert's shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible. Robert turned to look at his wife and daughters, this family that had been forged in crisis and had emerged stronger than he could have dreamed. He thought about Catherine and knew she would be happy that her daughters were loved, that her final wishes had been honored in ways she couldn't have predicted. He thought about Victoria and felt nothing but pity for a woman who had been so consumed by jealousy and ambition that she had destroyed her own life. And he thought about Maria, the woman whose courage and love had saved his daughters and, in doing so, had saved him. Maria felt Robert's gaze and turned to smile at him, that radiant smile that still made his heart skip a beat. In her eyes, he saw their past, their present, and their future, all woven together into something beautiful and enduring. Emily toddled over, sand covering her dress, and climbed onto Maria's lap with the confident expectation of being welcomed. Grace followed more carefully, settling against Robert's side. The four of them sat together as the sun began to set, casting golden light across the yard, a portrait of a family that had found each other against impossible odds. In the center of it all were two little girls who, though too young to remember the darkness they had survived, would grow up knowing only love, safety, and the unshakable truth that they were cherished beyond measure by the two people who had fought heaven and earth to keep them safe and together.